Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Bungacast. This is Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil. It's Sunday, the 4th of September. I'm with George Hoare and Phil Cunliffe, who are in the UK. And this is the first in an out-of-series series, if you want to call it that, called Bungazão 2022, where we look forward to the Brazilian election and eventually we'll probably look back on the Brazilian election when we get to that point. We're less than a month away from the first round of the election, so this is a good time to talk about it. And before I bring in the guest that we have on today, I'm going to ask Phil and George, you guys looking forward to the Brazilian election? You guys have been here. You've read a bit about Brazil. You're familiar, I guess, with the Brazilian politics. What stands out to you from what you know?
I think I want to go back to Brazil more than I'm interested in the Brazilian election.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people here feel that way as well.
It's the return of Lula who's the big thing, right? I mean, that's the big kind of standout question, I think, from at least looking from the outside. I think it would be, from the global perspective, it's somewhat embarrassing for the narrative of the tide of global fascism, given the electoral or polling difficulties that Bolsonaro seems to have encountered. There, obviously, it's, kind of who knows what will happen in the election itself. And also the prospect of a new pink tide. These endless pink tides washing over Latin America that leave absolutely nothing behind. Because if Lula wins, then you'll have a whole swathe of leftist governments across Latin America, and no doubt they'll have even less to show for themselves than the first pink tide did. But hope springs eternal and all that. So that'll be another kind of long, endless series of debates on the left about all the little things, modest kind of things they'll try to achieve and probably won't.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, right, George.
A pink tide comes in, tide goes out. I mean, it's a cyclical kind of thing. I guess the question is who is the moon? Which political figure is the moon, which is determining the
global economy and commodity prices, probably more than anything else. Which suggests the level of dependency going on.
That's a very abstract moon. And yeah, of course, Alex, you were explaining before we started recording that Lula means squid in Brazilian Portuguese. So this election is a squid game. It's a big bunga, a bit of a mess, as as I think many commentators have pointed out for a variety of reasons. But no, I think a lot of what Phil I'd echo a lot of what Phil said, but most particularly the aspiration to go back to experience Carnival in Sao Paulo, or ideally even in Rio, if it's not cancelled again due to COVID worries. But no, I think it's it's going to be a good barometer for some of the I guess to see how Bolsonaro's coalition holds up. That's going to be something which I think will be really important, and to see whether the great hope of Latin American socialism, Lula, who are, for all of his limitations, is an unbelievably impressive politician, to see how he does now that he's, don't call it a comeback, but he is back in the ring.
Yeah, indeed. So you're going to hear me speaking to Alcysio Canette, who I introduced in the recording, and then we'll come back and discuss a little bit more about some of the issues that we heard. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm here with my friend Alcysio Canette, who's a communist lawyer and a researcher, or maybe he's just a lawyer and a communist. I don't know. This is a little bit like that thing from Breaking Bad where he needs a criminal lawyer, or is it a lawyer who is a criminal? I don't know. I'll let Alcysio explain. Hi, Alcysio.
Hi. All lawyers are criminals, so it's a guild,
Yeah. A jack of all trades. What you're telling me, you just need to be kind of helpful in all areas.
Yeah, you gotta help the things go smooth, Yeah. Sometimes that involves disposing a little corpse here and there, but
Right. Actually, we're going to talk a little bit about disposing of a corpse in just a second. Let me just set this up for listeners. We're recording this on Friday, the 2nd of September, which means that we're exactly a month away from the first round of the election. As listeners will probably have gathered by now, it's a fight between Lula of the Workers' Party, or PT henceforth, and Bolsonaro, who's back at the party he started his career with, the Liberal Party, or PL. But another little thing about Brazil, most parties don't matter other than a couple of very big ones. Party allegiances are fairly meaningless and it's extremely promiscuous. Anyway, Lula until recently has held a lead which has been commanding enough to win an absolute majority in the first round. But now the polls have tightened to something like 45% for Lula, 32% for Bolsonaro, and the rest of the field made up of various candidates positioning themselves somewhere in between the two on 17%, though no individual third way candidate has more than 10%. So it's basically a two-horse race, and it has been ever since Lula regained his political rights and announced he would run again. So that's just to kind of set up what the race looks like. It is basically Lula Bolsonaro, and the question now is whether there'll be a second round. But what we're going to talk about here is not so much directly the polling and policies, but a little bit of a backdrop of what the important forces are that have shaped Brazil over the past couple of years and indeed over the past 30 years. So anyway, before we do all that, I'd like Alcysio to tell us about a fascinating podcast that he's a part of, that he's producing, which is a sort of and correct me if I'm wrong in my characterization, a sort of true crime drama, but which is also a political expose of corruption under the dictatorship. It's called Cálice. So why don't you tell us?
Yeah, it's a good description. I mean, the true crime fad makes it look like it's going to be like we're gonna talk about the autopsy and stuff. It's not really there. We kind of go more in the direction of the political intrigue that happened of this victim, whose name is José Jobim. He was a diplomat. He was a former diplomat. He was already retired, and because of his career connections, he was very into the construction of Itaipu Nacional, which until 10, 20 years ago was the biggest hydro dam ever built, and it's like 25% of our electricity comes from that one dam, so it was big, important, massive works. And it's like by far the largest corruption scandal in the history of Brazil, probably the planet, because it was estimated to cost like $1 billion, and then it ended costing $35 billion. So that's a big gap. And there's like a rampant corruption everywhere. And because that was like the crown jewel of the military dictatorship, they really tried to suppress that. And his murder was part of the attempt to suppress, because in 1979, the dictatorship was already crumbling. They had already a big scandal and nuclear plant. Brazil and Germany, West Germany, they had a deal, and the deal was very weird, and the nuclear plants essentially never were built. We bought 8, and we have 2 functioning today, and one is like halfway through. So you can guess like lots of things were bad, and there's a lot of
there was a bit of overbilling.
Yeah, no, it's a big story. If I know the story, but if I explain here, we're gonna be like for the next 45 minutes, and it's not the point. They were already like they had a big issue with that in 1977, because it went public that they like had issues in that contract. So corruption was something that was being talked about, and if they started talking about corruption in the biggest works of the dictatorship, the thing that they used for every type of propaganda they did, Figueiredo might have not finished his tenure that just started in that year. He was murdered a week after Figueiredo came to power. When we do it in English, if you understand Portuguese, I highly recommend you follow it, but we have the intention to do it in English. And when we get there, like, he was probably flagged for murder at the event where Figueiredo came into power, because he was invited. He was a dear friend of the new Ministry of External Relations. They were very close friends, so he was invited for the party and stuff, and he was probably flagged for murder there. So you can tell that's and the story is like very complex, because we have to go deep into understanding like the way they staged him, like, and you go all the way to Algeria to the story of Paul Sarré and to the story of the School of the Americas. It's a very large conspiracy, and Kissinger was involved in the conspiracy of the Itaipu Dam, and there's a lot of issues in Paraguay because everybody knew that Stroessner, the dictatorship of Paraguay, he was a serial pedophile, and you have like cables that said, like, look, the guy is going around drunk with 13-year-old kids, and it's really, really hard for us to support that. And the Americans say, oh, forget about it.
Yeah.
Look the other way. So it's a very complicated story, and we're going to try and show how does a state murder someone. And unlike the modern way, where you just throw a bomb at him and you celebrate on a press conference, back then they had a different set of rules to do that.
And especially someone so senior and connected to the state, a former diplomat.
Yeah,
so
it's like, for like Americans and stuff, it's like someone killed, I don't know, a senior advisor, because he was responsible for the Itaipu Dam project getting up and going. So it's like killing Dick Cheney or something.
Yeah, which maybe wouldn't be a bad idea, but that's a whole other story.
Is he alive?
Just about, I think. So it's ongoing, obviously, the podcast, and hopefully there'll be an English version. Brazilian listeners or people who understand Portuguese, highly recommend you check it out. It's called Cálice, and we'll look forward to a version in English, because it is a story worth telling, and I think it also sets us up nicely because, the themes, obviously, in terms of military dictatorship and corruption are things that we're going to be touching upon as we go forward, talking about contemporary Brazil. We're going to talk more directly about the military, what its role has been in politics. And of course, Bolsonaro is very closely associated with the military, the former army captain himself. And in fact, presents a kind of curious situation where not so senior an officer is the head of state, a head of military and consorting with 4-star generals and so on. Before we do that, though, we want to kind of flash back to the pandemic and what Bolsonaro's role was in the pandemic, and also, and perhaps more importantly, how the pandemic destroyed Bolsonaro's image. And Alcysio, you wrote a piece last year in Jacobin, in the English language Jacobin, on this. So why don't you tell us a little bit what your argument is around this?
So the thing is, Bolsonaro rose to power from a relatively unknown position, and he managed to really take every bit of advantage he had from being relatively unknown, because he managed to be very segmented in his propaganda. So the Bolsonaro that the evangelicals saw was a family man, a sensible guy, a sensitive man who really liked his family and really just wanted to stop people from being turned gay in schools. And so the bikers and the I want my guns type of people saw that alpha male guy who really want to kill, and he really managed to curate his image to every type of elector. So he managed to control several narratives at the same time, especially because the left really abandoned popular and social network communication. Like the left essentially said, well, we don't want to use Facebook, we don't want to use Instagram, we're going to huddle up in Twitter and complain. So the right had like free reign in their propaganda efforts, and Bolsonaro really, really went with that.
And of course, it's important to note that Bolsonaro, because he was relatively unknown, could present himself as various things to various people. I mean, he ended up being in some ways a receptacle for various people's frustrations and angers without having to present a kind of determinate image. So I think a lot of people voted for him not really being aware of who he was, despite him having been a congressman for 7 consecutive terms. But he didn't really have the sort of major profile over a long period of time. He became identified with a very virulent anti-corruption and anti-Workers' Party discourse, but only as of around 2015. So by the time 2018 came around, he still didn't have the sort of national profile that other politicians had.
Yeah, he really took advantage of that. And the pandemic it changed everything because people looked at their leader for an answer, like, what you gonna do, man? And, well, he essentially said, well, I don't give a shit about science. I don't care about anything. We're gonna just pretend there's no virus. Everything's gonna stay open. And, you catch, you die, you survive. That's how life goes. Everybody dies. And that really rang bad in a lot of people who voted for him, especially his evangelical base, which is the largest proportional electoral base he has. Evangelicals are around like 25 to 35% of the population. We don't know because he never did a census. He's stalling on the census. We're just about doing it now, and the results are going to be in like next year.
That's a whole story in its own right, actually.
Yes.
The fact that Brazil
he defunded
delayed its
the
2020.
census.
Well, like one of the basic kind of capacities of the state was defunded, so no census happened in 2020.
Yeah, and that's related to the pandemic because if you count every head, you're gonna see a lot of people died, and the 700,000 people dead figure is probably very underestimated, and specialists kind of think we're about 1.2 million, which is about 0.5% of the whole country. It's a lot of people to die. Like we had rampant COVID deaths, and I often even spoke to Alex like the discourse over lockdowns and not lockdowns in Europe and Asia and stuff. Oh, that's China. Look at what China's doing. I said, man, if only we had what China's doing, because what we have here, the exact opposite. That's to pretend there's no illness in a country where we have a public health system, but it's not great, and the private health system is even worse because they sell themselves as being good, but they have nowhere near the beds and the care and the infrastructure they claim they have. It's all bogus, and that created, another myriad of issues. So it was very odd that on paper, the private sector is much more equipped than the public sector to deal with patients and stuff. And in reality, what we saw is that the private system collapsed, and people had to resort to the public system. Not only for vaccines, but for treatment and for oxygen and stuff. So there was a very odd, not very odd, but very interesting result of the pandemic. But when he denied the right to people to protect themselves and said, well, if you die, you die, like a very action movie approach to healthcare, he alienated his base. People started to see him differently, and the discourse over the whole investigation, we had a public inquiry around the pandemic here. It really ran in the last from April to last September, October. That really ran the political narrative in the country, and he really lost a lot of support. And people they don't trust him anymore. The whole vaccine thing really got him because vaccination is something that's very ingrained in Brazilian culture.
There's a widespread support. There isn't an anti-vax movement.
Yes, the anti-vax movement was created in his government.
Yeah.
Prior to Bolsonaro, we had like 98-99% vaccination of everything, like polio, measles, you name it. And curiously, this story is very much related to the military, because the first mass vaccination effort we had in Brazil was in the 70s, was due to a strike. The guys from Uzi Minas, which is like steel factory, state-owned at the time, they went on strike because they had a meningitis epidemic in Brazil. In the 70s, during the Brazilian dictatorship, we had a major meningitis epidemic, and nobody knows how many people died, what happened, because the military buried everything. Part of the Cemitério de Perus graveyard, which is a secret graveyard they had in São Paulo to hide all sorts of dead bodies they wanted to hide, was full of people who died from meningitis, and they hid from their public records that they were even dead. So nobody knows how many people died. Some say like 20 to 30,000, but meningitis is an illness that get mostly children, and that's very spotty because people didn't have the regular birth certificate. So many probably just never had it and just went under the radar. So these guys, they went into strike and said, look, if you don't vaccinate the whole city, we're not going to work. And they made the military buy like 100,000 vaccines for meningitis, and the wind caught that they was vaccinating some, and they had a popular pressure to vaccinate others. And then they said, well, let's gonna run with it, and let's vaccinate them for other stuff. And that's how vaccination became a thing in Brazil, because it really stopped an epidemic. So people really like their vaccines. I've never seen, I only seen in my life one case of someone who was like an anti-vaxxer, and their kids got measles and they regretted it. So,
and I think that's some important scene setting actually for European, North American listeners and so on, who might perceive the question of the pandemic in Brazil through the lens of what they're familiar with. I think that's very important to underline. Again, the kind of mass support for vaccination, a general kind of concern with health, and I think a desire for most Brazilians that the health service be improved because there is a public health system, and also the Bolsonaro's denialism. I don't think played in the way that, for example, Trump's attitude to COVID did in the US, in terms of having a fairly large, substantial part of his supporters and the Republican Party going along with his sort of rhetoric against and sort of denialism of the pandemic. What was in play in Brazil was something rather different. Of course, Bolsonaro's support base, the hardcore nucleus, maybe liked some of his kind of bravado attitude. He was on camera mocking people dying of suffocation, lacking oxygen, and also, exclaiming, so what do you want me to do, in the face of, 600,000 people dying or more. So I think it's important, I guess, to set the scene, and I guess to say that the situation in Brazil was rather different. And, unfortunately, Bolsonaro is often compared to Trump, and I'm often at pains to emphasize some very important divergences and differences. But anyway, Alcysio, I'll let you kind of carry on, because to take us forward to the congressional inquiry that happened last year, how did that expose Bolsonaro? Because I think there were some important cases involving corruption, involving non-purchase of vaccines and so on. So I'll let you take the story on.
So, it was found in the presidential emails that he denied contact with Pfizer 75 times. He delayed their purchase as much as he could. He boycotted the vaccination program that state of São Paulo developed with the Chinese government. The deal they struck with AstraZeneca for making vaccines at their state-run vaccine factory in Rio was a bad one. They just like didn't. They had to requalify their production line, and they didn't fund it, so it was never getting done. And from the get-go, he said, well, vaccination is going to be optional, nobody's going to get vaccinated. And he started to be pressured by his own base. Like, oh, what you talking about? I want my vaccine. So, and he never managed to adapt. Because Bolsonaro is a very inflexible man, because he's a fucking paranoid man. So in that situation, people started looking more and more to the inquiry. And the deals that were being done were dodgy, to say the least. Like, we had a lot of former military colonels, especially colonels and generals, trying to lobby to make very underhanded deals with unknown vaccine manufacturers. Deals that were clearly, you can tell from afar there's no vaccine there. Like, it's clearly a scheme to make money. And the way they poured resources, like endless resources, into making hydroxychloroquine, and that never led anywhere. Like, we have a lack of hydroxychloroquine now to treat malaria, which is what it's supposed to treat in the indigenous populations. In the whole, I'm not even gonna get into how he treated the indigenous populations in Brazil directly, because it's from top to bottom dreadful and genocidal. And to be honest, we really don't have the time. He really tried to eliminate them.
That's an episode in its own right. Yeah.
Yeah, he really tried to kill them off in every way he could, and sadly, it does not detract from his votes. That it's sadly the general understanding of the population that is nobody cares. But anyway, when people started looking, like, well, what? Like, some guy get into the Ministry of Health, some unknown guy. He was a corporal from the military police of Minas Gerais, a guy who, nobody knew who he was. He never had, like, a distinct public office or anything. He walked into the Ministry of Health with a proposition like, oh, you buy this 400 million doses of vaccine that's already done. Like, everybody's in the world is scrambling for vaccine, but this corporal from the military police of the state of Minas Gerais, well, he had 400 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccines already made, packaged, ready to be sent. But he wanted $1 a dose of, hush money. And that became public, and it was like bizarre. So that was the big scandal. Like, people were trying to make money of the fact that the Ministry of Health was very poorly structured. It was being run by a blatant incompetent General Pazuello, who has himself been adjacent to very weird cases. When he ran he was a supply general, right? And when he ran the supply, the main supply hub of armaments of the military here in Rio, like every other month, all the ammo was robbed. It was crazy. It was robbed 3 times, like in the order of tens of millions of rounds were just stolen. It's crazy, man.
And all this is important because, I mean, we're going to come to talk about this more directly, but the military tries to portray or present an image of competence, of getting things done in a country where things are corrupt and, there's backhanders and judicial wrangling and so on. And so it's important that this military figure placed in situ as health ministry managed to mess things up so badly.
And he let people drown in the dry in Manaus. Manaus, if you don't know, it's an Amazon city, was not really connected by roads, so it's really hard to make supplies get there.
And it's a large city of 2 million people or something. So
yeah, it's a big city, and they had, of course, an oxygen factory that was local, but it just couldn't cope with the volume they needed. And the state of Amazonas told them, look, we're really gonna need some oxygen. And he said, oh yeah, all right. And he did nothing. He let at least 150 people drown in their own fluids because he was just blatantly incompetent. He just didn't care.
And of course, the most striking irony of this is that ultimately Venezuela shipped in oxygen to help, hospitals in Manaus, COVID patients. And of course, the irony is that the Bolsonaro government has, repeatedly gestured at Venezuela as a sort of communist dictatorship. And if we don't, play the anti-communist card effectively, that if, we don't rule Brazil, Brazil will become a Venezuela. So kind of delicious irony there.
Yeah, the Venezuelans, they really, really helped. But they could have helped more because they said, well, you should just, come here, take everything you need. We give you a plane. And they said, no, we don't want any help from you. And they took the oxygen by road. And that took like 3 days. And they never thanked the Venezuelans. And they never asked for it. And it was very, very bad. Because, I mean, even if you're like a maniac, because the Ministry of external relations that Brazil had at that point, it was a complete madman. Like, if you look at his face, you say, "Oh, that guy is not 100%." And he once said, like, "We're going to be a proud pariah of the world. Like, we don't want relations with anyone. We were special." And he was the minister, so you can imagine how bad that was.
Turning a little bit more to the kind of politics and the sort of analysis of what this means. I mean, I have a theory, and, Alcysio, tell me if you agree or not, that, Bolsonaro represented in some ways anti-politics in government. I mean, he was elected effectively on a sort of anti-politics ticket, surfing the wave of the protests and demands around anti-corruption, rejection of the Workers' Party, who had, I'm sure listeners are familiar, been wrapped up in a massive corruption scandal, which rolled on from 2014 to 16, 17, and it was constantly in the news. Now, that sort of anti-politics in government, what does that look like when, you are the politics suddenly, or you're an administration? I think it, to a certain extent, is parasitic on things actually working. So you can signal your distance, and your hatred of the establishment, of the mainstream, pose as an outsider and so on. And that works so long as things more or less are working, just at a kind of basic level. But once the sort of basic functions of the state, like, for example, healthcare, start falling apart as they did during the pandemic with, various health systems in collapse, that then becomes problematic because your anti-politics kind of falls on deaf ears. You're, people generally expecting the government to have some basic competence in making things keep running. And I think that's the kind of contradiction that the Bolsonaro government found itself suddenly with the pandemic and why it lost so much support.
Actually, I do disagree a bit. He really runs with his, now very diminished base, that the reason why things are crumbling is because he's an outsider, he's being boycotted. And nobody wants to let him do what he really needs to do. But, most people will say that's bullshit.
But that's the point. His hardcore will stick behind him. And his hardcore base is probably somewhere around 20% of the population. But, he was elected with 55% in the second round. And so large swathes of kind of the mainstream, at a kind of establishment level, kind of stopped supporting him, in terms of in the media and so on, as well as large swathes of the population. So as a consequence, he has to continually double down on his kind of most extreme rhetoric because just to play to sustain his hardcore base. And I think that's just, until the election anyway, that's been his modus operandi.
Yeah, and the fact, it's not only the health collapse, like the economy is in the doldrums. We had rampant inflation, and it's not because of the war, it's not because of external reasons, it's because he essentially gutted our means of inflationary regulation. Like, the Brazilian government had a very well established method of not letting food prices go up, because the government bought essentially every single staple food we eat, and they stored it, and they regulated the prices by storing it in their own storage. And he gutted it all, and now rice went up, beans went up, corn went up, maize went up, milk is through the roof, and people just cannot have like a normal diet. Red meat, which Brazil is probably the biggest producer in the world, is is completely inaccessible to probably 65% of the population right now. So you can tell that something's really wrong.
Yeah, and that has allowed, I mean, in the electoral context, Lula and the Workers' Party to kind of play the image that they would have done anyway, but it allows it to land all that much harder of a kind of return to the good times, right? So Lula will talk about being able to have a beer and a barbecue at the weekend and make that accessible to the majority of the population once again, which it now isn't. And I wanted to just mention that as a means to kind of just make a little bracket here and talk a little bit about what the left's role throughout the pandemic and throughout Bolsonaro's rule has been, because the extent to which they provided leadership against Bolsonaro is really questionable, I think. And the Workers' Party in particular has, because of inflation, because of the massive price rises, has been landed in a relatively favorable situation. Had that not been the case, I think the election would be much tighter than it actually looks like, according to the polls.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Bolsonaro still would have the benefit of the doubt. He has, he has the state in his hand, which is very helpful to run an election. He's running on highly illegal maneuvers to try and to make people vote for him. Essentially, he's just throwing money everywhere. He's a very weak president, and the Congress just loves him for that, because he can run the country without asking him whatever. So Arthur Lira, who runs the House, he essentially is the president, because he's the one who do, the budget. The budget is all on him. And he has a secret budget that's all his. And he can do whatever he wants, no accountability, no one, the public cannot see. And that is going directly to the places where he can get most votes. So that's a very powerful machine for you to have. And even with all that, Bolsonaro is very behind, because the economy is so bad. Like, it's really bad, and they say it's good, which I think makes people even angrier, because, like, if you say, like, well, it's not great, but we're trying to do something here, just wait and you'll see, maybe people have a little patience. But when you say, no, you're crazy, everything's good, like, you're trying to, like, gaslight the population into believe that the prices haven't risen, people say, well, this guy is a fool. He has no clue what he's doing.
Yeah, and most recently he said that there's no hunger in Brazil. It's not like you see people asking for bread outside of the bakery, and it's like anybody who lives in Brazil will, I see it every single day. You're outside the bakery, and there's people begging for bread. So it very much is the case. But I did want to just return to something. How would you characterize, just to kind of briefly kind of put a nail on it, how would you characterize the left kind of performance over the Bolsonaro period? What has it done?
Well, let's go. PT is running, is trying to make itself anew. They had a lot of very old people running the party. And these people are not electable anymore. And that second generation, that generation of like people who'd be like in the 50s and 40s, which is like prime age for public office, you'd say, they did not stick. Like, people don't like them. They never were like viable electoral options. Like, they got elected like when Lula was creaming, because Lula made them their careers, but they don't have a lot of their own merits. They have very little charisma. The likes of Fernando Haddad and Jacques Wagner and stuff. These people, they're not the future of the party. So the party has really realized they need to put up a new generation of very young people. And if you look at the youngest generation of candidates and party members, like they run elections, you see a more diverse cadre of people. You see many more women running for office, and you can tell the party said, look, we really need to adapt to the times. No more like university professor types running for office, and they try to renew. But in the meantime, they were absolutely destroyed by the polls and the votes, because the left in general has been pummeled in the elections since 2016. So they're trying to steady the ship while running very big internal changes, and they really struggle. But they are a very large party that has very good union connections and connections in the rural area of the country of MST, which is the largest social movement in Latin America. And so they're going to be all right, I'd say. they're gonna transition well, but they needed to be off the spot for a bit. Like the other parties, they really had a chance here. Like if you're PSOL, if you're PDT,
yeah, PSOL being the Party of Socialism and Liberty, which was a break off from the PT in the 2000s.
Yeah. A PDT is a traditional party that came from Leonel Brizola, which was like one of the stalwarts of Brazilian resistance to the military dictatorship, and now became sort of a weird party. Like it's got a bit of neo-Nazi infiltration and Duginism and Nazbol types going around, so it's kind of weird.
And traditionally was more of a kind of national developmentalist party associated with that, and now, I mean, arguably, Ciro Gomes, I think, is probably the last remnants of a bourgeois developmentalism in Brazil. I mean, I think that's what he represents. And it's very free.
I don't agree. Lula is much more of that than he is, and he's successful. Ciro is just talk, man. He thinks of himself as a very intelligent, articulate man, but if you look at what he says, it doesn't make sense. But anyway, PSOL especially, they had a chance. Like, well, PT are not doing well. They're retreating. They're strategically retreating from a lot of places. They're not running a lot of candidates in the main elections because they know they have no chance of winning big mayors and big cities or even states. They try to hide a little bit. And PSOL did nothing with that.
And PSOL were to the left of PT, and to a certain extent, acted as a sort of moral conscience of the Workers' Party, and the Workers' Party increasing kind of institutionalization over the period that Lula was in power made PSOL its appeal to certain people was precisely that it kind of remained truer to its to the PT's original roots.
Yeah, that's the main issue. Like, it's a moral conundrum they have. It's not an organization conundrum. They don't look at what PT has done, what is the really big mistake they did. As they got institutionalized as the party in government, they really strained their relations with their base, and they really left in the hands of the evangelical churches, which are not reliable and very conservative and very connected to the tele-evangelist movement of the United States. And if you're connected to people like that, you know what you're gonna get. So PSOL had a chance. Say, whoa, these people are for the taking. Let's go. And they realized they had to go really far off where they live. Travel by bus. That's not gonna bother. Like, essentially, if you look what the stuff that happened in Rio and São Paulo, PSOL really gets votes in upper middle class neighborhoods of a left leaning, and all their candidates, they fight for the same chunk of votes. They do not expand from that. They do not expand from that because they have no social connections to the people, essentially. They have very little work in that sense. They're very entrenched in their university campuses and stuff. And they kind of allergic to people in general. It's weird. Like, it's hard to, like, if you're an outsider, like, it's hard to explain to people they're not from here, but it's people that they're very illuminist in the sense that it
kind of enlightenment
view. They think they're Prometheus and they're bringing the truth of to the masses, and they're gonna teach the masses how to behave and how to think, and they have a very moral take on society. And
I think overseas viewers will recognize the sort of tendency that it exists. It exists elsewhere. A good example on how PSOL really did themselves here in Rio. Like, it was in February this year. We're gonna have Carnival, right? Very important date. Not only because we needed the catharsis, and we really needed it, but because it's
economically is the biggest week of Rio. Like they kind of do like 4 or 5 billion in taxes alone in 5 days. Hotels and the people, they really make their year there. Like the people who do the costumes for the parties, who play in parties, who sell stuff. It's really important for the local economy. And they cancelled Carnival and they celebrated it. They essentially celebrated letting a lot of people without food in their pantries because they had nothing to do for work.
Yeah, and they canceled that because of the pandemic. You know, I mean, that was
which was kind of over.
Yeah, by that point, exactly.
And we're not. And the worst part is that everything is on the open. There's no close quarters. People don't celebrate Carnival in elevators. They celebrate on the streets. Contagion rates would not increase by a lot. Like maybe 2 or 3 more people die off of COVID. Not 3,000, not 3 million, 3. Because it's not going to be a lot. It's not going to be a lot of extra contagion because of people walking on the street celebrating. And the private parties, the ones in our conditioned spaces, those one happened. So we had essentially a movement of privatization of Carnival, and the left celebrated it. And they wonder why they don't like them anymore. How come these people of Carnival, which everybody knows someone who works there, they hate them and they campaign against them? Why would that be? And they really don't understand because, well, we defend their thing. Like, we're not against it.
Yeah, we're doing this for you. We're doing, yeah. It's, I mean, anyway, I think people will recognize a certain kind of moralistic posture amongst, whatever, the university educated intelligentsia and so on. I didn't want to spend too long on the left specifically, but I think listeners will get the general picture of a emaciated left where the PT remains the only real party actually in the whole country, the only mass party, but itself which has been incredibly bureaucratized and so on. And listeners can check out past episodes which we've done years ago on Brazil which cover this a little bit more directly. What I wanted to turn to now, though, is specifically the military. I mean, we've already touched on the fact that the image of the military was damaged by its management, which is, a nice way to put it. It's non-management of the pandemic and their sheer incompetency. And the backdrop to this, of course, is that the military has entered en masse into politics, and not just at the electoral level, but at the administrative level. So it has taken over large parts of the state at various levels, federal, state, municipal, and in the kind of civil service as well, whether it's retired or not, a reserve military or even active military. And one of the ways that this is spoken about, and I know Alcysio disagrees with this portrayal of it, so I'm interested to hear what his take is on it. But it's often spoken about as the military party, as if the military is a discrete body which has its own interests within the state rather than being what it should be, which is the state's external defense. So what do you think of this military party? What has been its role?
Well, I don't agree with the description of military party because it entails a lot of characteristics they really don't possess. Like, they don't see themselves as a part of the political game, which a party is. They see themselves above the political game because they see themselves as, the father of the nation in some sense. Because, well, you see, they have this very large positivist tradition like Auguste Comte and stuff, and they really see themselves through that light. And you see, like, social science in Brazil till the 50s or 60s, they really have had one big paradigm. That was, the people is shit. We are an amalgamation of the worst in like genetics, really. Like we're a breed of African scum with lazy indigenous and the very complicated people of the Iberic Peninsula. And so this Brazilian population is, by its design, irreparable. So we, the military, the special people, the ones who have risen above and beyond because we are disciplined and because we accept these natural structures of society, we have to lead them to greatness. So that's how they roll, essentially.
Yeah.
And that has essentially made them run 25 years in power from 64 to 85. And now what they did with Bolsonaro, and even before with Vargas, and they were the ones who made us a republic. They took the emperor away, and so they're constantly trying to make it all about them.
And Brazilian history has been a story of, it's the single most important continuous actor or force across Brazilian history, and they keep recurring. And I think that's important. And just to add one thing about the military self-conception vis-a-vis the Brazilian people is that it's a military with pretty limited offensive capabilities and who has always sought to target what it sees as the internal enemy. And that of course is, communists and various other marginal groups, the poor and so on. And I think that's been generally its orientation, not as as an offensive force abroad, but as one which maintains order at home and combats the internal enemy. Sorry, Alcysio, go ahead.
Yeah, but there's a main difference from 64 and before and 64 and, after. Because in 64, they really purged everyone. If you were not in their club, you were either dead or exiled. Military men, in general, were the main victims of the dictatorship. About 5,000 or 6,000 were sacked like instantly. 400 of it, they estimated like 400 of them were killed off or disappeared. And many more were persecuted. Like any sort of ideological difference with the main military line of thought was completely purged from the military, and they never came back because what they taught in the military schools and the academies never changed. They still use the same books they did in 75 or 76 today. The same old communist paranoia. So everyone's being really indoctrinated from the same ideological basis for the last 40 years. So if you read that stuff, you get like, these people are complete maniacs. They have no connection to reality. And people who have no connection to reality but have all the guns are very dangerous.
And so Brazil returns to democracy at the end of the 80s, and it's a mixed bag, to put it that way. The Brazilian constitution retains lots of old backward features, as well as inscribing a whole new raft of social rights, and it's an uneasy balance. And the extent to which what is realized, or the extent to which the promises of the Constitution can be realized, depend very much on the balance of forces at any given time. And the reality is that the balance of forces have been, in recent periods, very much against a lot of the realization of a lot of those promises. So I think we can speak of this in terms of maybe a frustrated redemocratization. I think these are the terms that you put it as. How would you describe it?
Well, we really need to put a light on Figueiredo's government, who was the last of the military dictators. It's a weird feature of Brazilian dictatorship. We have 5 of them. They ran elections amongst them to change the guard.
They were so good they had 5 of them. Yeah.
yeah. So Figueiredo, who rose to power in 79 and stayed to the end, he was about as stupid as Bolsonaro, maybe a little more, and his way of, dealing with stuff really took Brazil to the brink. Brazil was broke from the second oil crash onwards, Brazil was completely broke because we had all our debt was running dollars, and we had at that time no oil. We discovered oil in the 80s, so by 83 or 84 things were much better, but 81, 82, Brazil was essentially broke. Brazil had to resort to external help. The monetary fund came and saved the government with a loan. So the economy was really, really bad, and people even didn't realize how bad it was, because as much as there was rampant inflation, and we're talking about in the 1,000% category, not the 100% category. Is like inflation became a whole thing in the doldrums of the military government. The way he indebted the nation was so large, there was just they could not hold to power because they did not want to cede power in 85. The original plan was to cede power in 91, but when the country essentially ran broke in 82, they said, well, this toy is broken, and if we hold this until 91, we're done. We're going to get defunded forever. They might disband the military. So let's cede power. And they negotiated a very, very favorable terms for them. They got full amnesty. There was never questioned. Whenever it was questioned in the judiciary essentially said, yeah, well, it's a good law. It's fine. Just keep them free. So they got very satisfactory terms. The only time they really, really got a little bit back was when FHC ran the country from 94 to 2002, when he really defunded the military, like completely defunded them, and I think it was the best thing he ever did. But the military essentially never got off power.
And they were never held to account. Unlike what happened in Argentina, for example. I mean, the kind of confrontation with the past never really happened. It was kind of swept on the rug.
And that's the thing, the only reason Brazil ever had a confrontation with its past, it was because the Inter-American Court of Law in Costa Rica, they said Brazil had to. Like, we had an international treaty, you're under our jurisdiction, you're not investigating this stuff, you must do it. And by Dilma's government in 2013, like 20 odd years after the dictatorship was over, is that they started doing stuff. And even then, it's not like it was in Argentina. It was not like, well, let's give this information to investigators and let's indict people. No. It's more like, well, we're gonna document everything you did, and we're gonna show that what happened. Like, yes, this person was murdered here, and this person was murdered there. My partner in Cálice, he worked for that effort. He worked around the Guerrilla do Araguaia, which was an attempt of Maoist insurrection in the middle of the country that never came to much, but its members were absolutely butchered by the state, and then they were bored and they butchered every single other resident of the region, and they took the land. And that was actually that speaks a lot with how land is exploited in the Amazon these days. The criminal connections of wood and minerals and gold, it goes back to that expansion of the military there. So they really got everything they wanted. Like they held their connections to the organized crime, which they were a part of. They were part of the criminal connections in the Amazon forest. They were part of the Jogo do Bicho, which was like illegal gambling. Like they essentially ran illegal gambling in the country. So they got everything they wanted. They got the money, they got the protection. It was a very good deal for them. And the people, it's not that nobody wanted to do anything. Let's make that clear. We just did not have the power to do it. We tried to push for elections in the 80s. We just couldn't. They were too powerful. That's it. Like, they left in their terms, and they still play the game by their terms. I do not doubt that even if Lula wins the election with 100% of the votes, the military won't suffer anything.
So actually, that's a good moment to make reference to what actually happened when the PT was in power from 2003 until 2016, which is that certainly through the Lula years, the military was there in the background, as they always are. I think there was a certain accord between Lula and the military that Lula wouldn't try to neuter the military in any way. They would continue to keep their rights and privileges. They wouldn't be held to account for anything. And at the same time, the military would allow a former union leader to rule. And, you know, they have a certain fairly comfortable sort of arrangement. That changes a little bit under the Dilma government, who was Lula's successor, where she mounts this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that already that grades the military more. Of course, she was a former guerrilla as well, a woman now as head of state, and that already starts to, I think, sours relationships a little bit more. Alcysio.
Well, I kind of disagree with the relationship they had with Lula, because Lula did something that really aggrieved the military. He took them seriously. Okay. He invested in the military. We had two very large arms deals. One with France for the construction of a nuclear submarine, and a whole class. We built a plant of Scorpion series submarines in Brazil. So we really invested billions and billions in the Navy. There was a very large investment in the armed forces, with a big deal for the Gripen series fighter jets with Sweden. And the military did not like it. Because it's an army-centered thing, right? The other arms are essentially appendixes. And they perceived as being favored. So the army man said, "Whoa, that's not right. He's favoring them. Where are my new tanks and stuff?" So he sent them to Haiti. And that's where the story begins. The people who are in government now were sent in the MINUSTAH mission in Haiti. And they did
which was a UN mission, which Brazil played the leading role in.
Yeah, Brazil essentially ran the mission, and they committed acts of genocide in Haiti. They were serial rapists. The Haitian population absolutely hated us, our presence there. And the same guys who ran that operation, Braga Neto, Heleno, they're all in power now. They're Bolsonaro's right-hand man.
Yeah, and that is why that the Haiti mission was probably one of the largest, if not the most significant error committed by the PT and government, in my view, which has come back to bite it in the ass effectively. All right, everyone, that's the end of the free show. Though stick around, because Alcysio and I discussed the upcoming 7th of September Independence Day parades in Brazil. Last year, Bolsonaro tried to mount a show of force and build support for a coup. Is the same going to happen in 2 days' time? And what's the likelihood of a coup around the election? And what form would it take, if any? We asked whether Bolsonaro has the support of the military and the big bourgeoisie, usually the essential ingredients for a successful coup. That's all over on patreon.com/bungacast, where if you subscribe for $5 a month, you get access to that, plus 2 original exclusive episodes per month, unavailable elsewhere, as well as access to our active community on there, debating the central political issues of our times. Once again, it's patreon.com/bungacast, and we hope to see you over there. Catch you in a bit.